You know what's funny about secrets? They have this way of hiding in plain sight, disguised as normal life, until one random Tuesday afternoon they explode in your face, and you realize nothing, absolutely nothing, was ever what it seemed. I'm talking about the kind of secret that makes you question every conversation you've ever had, every kiss you've ever shared, every promise someone whispered in the dark. The kind that makes you wonder if you ever really knew the person sleeping next to you, or if you've been living with a stranger wearing a mask so perfect you never saw the cracks. What happened next in my life wasn't just shocking. It was the kind of truth that shatters your entire reality and forces you to rebuild yourself from the ground up. Picture this. You're 7 months pregnant, glowing with that maternal joy everyone talks about, lying on an exam table waiting to see your baby's heartbeat on a monitor. Then the doctor sees your husband's name on the paperwork, and her face goes white. Not concerned white, not confused white, but horror movie white, the kind that makes your blood freeze in your veins. She stops the ultrasound mid-exam, closes the door. She checked the hallway first, lowered her voice, and tells you something so insane, so impossibly cruel, that you physically can't process it at first. You need to leave your husband today, she whispers, hands shaking. Get a divorce lawyer before you go home. Don't tell him anything. Just run. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Couldn't understand how a routine prenatal appointment had turned into a scene from a psychological thriller. The truth she revealed wasn't about infidelity in the way you'd expect. It wasn't a simple affair or a one-night mistake. What my husband had done was so calculated, so methodical, so breathtakingly evil, that it made cheating look like child's play. He'd been planning my destruction for years. Literally, years. Orchestrating every detail, manipulating every situation, setting up a trap so perfect that when it finally sprung, I'd lose everything. My money, my reputation, my home, my dignity, maybe even my child. And the most humiliated I've ever felt, it was realizing how completely I'd been fooled, how every "I love you" had been a lie, how the man I'd trusted with my body, my future, my family legacy, was actually a predator who'd chosen me like a hunter chooses prey. But here's where this story gets interesting, where the betrayal transforms into something else entirely. Because that doctor's warning, that closed door and whispered confession, it was the thread that unraveled everything. Once I started pulling, once I stopped being the naive wife and became the woman my grandmother raised me to be, I uncovered layers of deception so deep they'd make your head spin. Lied to about fertility treatments, cheated in ways that went beyond physical betrayal, backstabbed by people I'd trusted in my most vulnerable moments. And at the center of it all was a man who thought he was smarter than everyone, who believed women like me were easy targets, who had no idea that revenge, real revenge, isn't hot and emotional. It's cold, calculated, and absolutely devastating when you have the truth on your side. What you're about to hear is the story of how I went from being a mark to being the person who marked him. How I took every weapon he'd built to destroy me and turned it back on him with precision that would make a surgeon jealous. This isn't just about payback or vengeance, though trust me, there's plenty of that. This is about justice, about reclaiming your self-worth when someone tries to steal it, about discovering that the people who underestimate you are setting themselves up for the most spectacular fall. My husband thought he'd planned the perfect crime. Then the truth came out. Karma showed up with receipts, and suddenly the hunter became the hunted, and I was the one holding the gun. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep them still on my lap. The gel on my belly was cold, clinical, but what made my blood turn to ice wasn't the temperature. It was the way Dr. Brennan's face completely drained of color the second she glanced at the intake form. She wasn't looking at the monitor anymore, wasn't smiling at the tiny heartbeat flickering on screen like she had been just seconds before. Her eyes were locked on one thing. The intake form had a spouse-partner line, and there it was. Grant Mercer, printed right there in black ink. I couldn't believe what happened next. She actually stopped mid-exam, her hand frozen in the air, and I swear I saw something like fear flash across her face. "Mrs. Harrison," she said, and her voice had this weird tremor to it, like she was forcing herself to stay calm. She pulled the ultrasound wand away, wiped the gel off with hands that weren't quite steady, and then did something I'll never forget. She checked the hallway, closed the door, and lowered her voice. The way she was looking at me now, with this mixture of pity and urgency, made every instinct in my body scream that something was terribly, horribly wrong. The shocking part? She hadn't even told me yet. She pulled her chair closer. So close our knees almost touched. And when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say, and I need you to trust me. The truth was written all over her face before she even opened her mouth. This wasn't about the baby's health. This wasn't about me. This was about him. My husband, Grant Mercer, the man I'd been building a life with, the father, or so I thought, of the child growing inside me. Dr. Brennan's next words hit me like a physical blow. You need to leave your husband today, before you go home. Get a divorce lawyer first. Don't tell him anything, just get out. I sat there completely frozen, humiliated by the tears that started burning behind my eyes. Because what do you even say to that? A doctor, a medical professional I'd just met 20 minutes ago, was begging me to run from my own marriage like my life depended on it. The betrayal of that moment, not knowing what I'd been betrayed by yet, but feeling it in every cell of my body, was suffocating. She kept talking, something about needing to explain, about starting from the beginning, but all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears and that one word echoing over and over. Divorce, divorce, divorce. I know this sounds insane, she continued. And she was right. It did. It sounded absolutely batshit crazy. But here's the thing about karma. Sometimes it doesn't wait for you to figure things out on your own. Sometimes it sends you a warning through the most unexpected messenger. And as I sat there in that exam room, with my baby's heartbeat still visible on the paused screen, and this stranger's desperate eyes boring into mine, I knew with absolute certainty that my entire life was about to shatter. I just had no idea how deep the lies actually went. Let me take you back to where this nightmare actually started, because you need to understand who I was before everything fell apart. My name is Elena Harrison. I'm 32 years old, and I come from what people love to call old money. The kind of family where your great-grandmother's portrait hangs in the historical society and your trust fund has more zeros than most people see in a lifetime. I kept my family name, Harrison, because in my world, names are legacies. They're not just what people call you, they're inheritances that span generations. I grew up in my grandmother's estate, this gorgeous Victorian mansion with gardens that bloom year-round, and a legacy that spans 4 generations of strong, dignified women. My whole life, I'd been taught that our family name meant something, that dignity and self-worth weren't negotiable, that we protected what was ours. Then I met Grant Mercer at a charity gala, and I forgot every single lesson. He was charming in that effortless way that should have been my first red flag. Too smooth, too perfect, too interested in every word I said. Grant was a financial advisor, or so he claimed, always impeccably dressed and always knowing exactly what to say to make me feel seen. We talked about art, about travel, about building something meaningful together. And God, I fell hard. Within 6 months we were engaged, and I was so drunk on what I thought was love that I didn't notice how quickly he started asking questions about the estate, about my grandmother's house, about the structure of my trust. Infidelity wasn't even on my radar back then. I was worried about wedding flowers and whether his mother would like me, not whether I was being set up for the biggest payback of my life. My mother, Vivian, saw right through him from day one. She pulled me aside a week before the wedding, her face tight with worry, and said something I'll never forget. Elena, there's something wrong with that man. I can feel it in my bones. But I was 30, successful, educated. I thought I knew better than my old-fashioned mother with her outdated suspicions. So I did the one thing I regret most in this entire story. I chose him over her. I told her she was being controlling, that she couldn't stand to see me happy, that maybe we needed some space. The backstabbed look on her face still haunts me, because she wasn't trying to control me. She was trying to save me. We didn't speak for almost 2 years after that. 2 years of holidays I spent with Grant's family instead of mine. 2 years of phone calls that went straight to voicemail. 2 years of building a life with a man, while the woman who actually loved me watched from a distance, powerless to protect me. Grant made sure of that distance too, always with little comments about how dramatic my mother was, how lucky I was to have broken free from her influence. The justice I thought I was serving myself, proving I could make my own choices, live my own life, was actually just isolation dressed up as independence. And the whole time, he was setting the stage for something so calculated, so cruel, that even now I can barely wrap my head around the fact that someone could plan that level of revenge against a person who'd done nothing but love them. That Victorian house I grew up in, the one with my grandmother's rose garden and the library full of first editions, Grant started mentioning it more and more. How much it was worth, how we could upgrade to something modern, how holding on to the past was keeping us from our future. Every conversation somehow circled back to money, to assets, to what we could do if we just liquidated some things. I thought he was being practical, planning for our future family. I couldn't believe how blind I was, how every single conversation was actually him taking inventory, figuring out exactly what he could take when he destroyed me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We're not at the destruction part yet. First, I had to become completely vulnerable. After a year of trying to get pregnant the old-fashioned way, we started to worry. Every negative test felt like a personal failure, and Grant was always there with the right words, the comforting touches, playing the supportive husband role so convincingly I never questioned it. We went to a fertility specialist together, sat through the awkward tests and uncomfortable conversations, and then came the devastating news. Severe male infertility. The doctor said our chances of conceiving naturally were basically zero, and I watched Grant's face crumble in what I thought was genuine heartbreak. He held my hand in that office, told me we'd figure it out together, that nothing would stop us from having our family. Looking back now, knowing the truth, I realize he was probably celebrating inside, because this was exactly the opening he needed. We decided to move forward with IVF, and that's when Grant became weirdly controlling about every detail. He insisted on choosing the clinic, some place called Meridian Fertility Center that his colleague recommended, and he handled all the paperwork, all the insurance forms, everything. At the time, I thought he was just being helpful, taking the burden off my shoulders so I could focus on preparing my body for the procedure. "You're going through enough physically," he'd say, kissing my forehead like the devoted husband. "Let me handle the administrative nightmare." Red flags were practically slapping me in the face, but I was so desperate to start our family, so grateful for his support, that I signed whatever he put in front of me without reading it carefully. The IVF process itself was brutal. Hormone injections that made me feel crazy, bloating, mood swings, the constant invasion of privacy with all the monitoring appointments. Grant came to some of the appointments but always seemed distracted, checking his phone, stepping out to take an important call. The nurses knew him by name, though, always greeting him warmly, and I remember feeling grateful that he'd built such a good rapport with the staff. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have possibly known, was that he'd built more than rapport. He'd built a conspiracy. He'd found the weak links in the system, the people whose dignity could be bought, and he'd paid them to betray every oath they'd ever taken. When we finally got the call that I was pregnant, I cried for an hour straight. Grant picked me up, spun me around, told me I was going to be the most amazing mother. We celebrated with expensive champagne that only he could drink, took 1,000 photos, called his family to share the news. I didn't call my mother. That wound was still too fresh, and Grant had spent 2 years making sure it stayed that way. But something shifted after that positive test. It was subtle at first, so subtle I thought maybe it was just pregnancy paranoia. But Grant started acting different, distant, like he was waiting for something, calculating something. And every time I caught him staring at me with this unreadable expression, he'd smile and blame it on processing the big news. The shocking part wasn't just that he'd been cheating on me, or lying to me, or planning to humiliate me. It was so much worse than any of that. What Grant had orchestrated was something I didn't even know was possible. Something so twisted and premeditated that it made every moment of our marriage feel like a scene from a horror movie where I'd been the only one who didn't know I was living in one. But I'm getting ahead of myself again, because before I learned the truth, I had to live through months of thinking everything was fine. Months of him setting up the final pieces of his revenge. Months of carrying a baby, while the man next to me was counting down the days until he could destroy me. And he almost succeeded. Around month 5 of my pregnancy, things started getting weird in ways I couldn't ignore anymore. I'd wake up at 2 a.m. to use the bathroom, because of course the baby was using my bladder as a trampoline. And I'd find Grant on his phone in the dark, the screen glow lighting up his face as he furiously typed something. The second he'd notice me, he'd flip it over, flash that perfect smile and say something about work emails or a client emergency. Then there was the second phone I found in his gym bag, buried under protein powder and dirty socks. When I asked him about it, he didn't even flinch. Just said it was his work line, to keep business separate from personal. The lie came out so smooth, so practiced, that I actually believed him. Or maybe I just wanted to believe him, because the alternative was too terrifying to consider. He started staying out late, coming home after midnight with explanations that sounded reasonable, but never quite added up. Dinner with the Johnsons ran long, or had to finish the Morrison portfolio, or my personal favorite, traffic was insane. But here's the thing about lies. They leave traces. I found restaurant receipts for places he'd never mentioned, charges on our credit card for a hotel downtown, mysterious Uber rides to addresses I didn't recognize. Every time I brought something up, every time I said, "Grant, this doesn't make sense," he'd turn it around on me so skillfully I'd end up apologizing. "Baby, it's the hormones," he'd say, pulling me close, rubbing my belly. "You're stressed. You're emotional. That's normal. Don't turn into one of those paranoid wives, okay? I chose you. I married you. I'm having a baby with you." That gaslighting, and that's exactly what it was, textbook gaslighting, made me question my own sanity. I'd lie awake at night, 6 months pregnant, and crying into my pillow, wondering if I was losing my mind. Was I being unreasonable? Was I letting pregnancy hormones turn me into someone I didn't want to be? Grant was so good at making me feel like the problem, like my suspicions were character flaws I needed to work on. Meanwhile, his real focus became crystal clear. Money. Specifically, my money. He started bringing up my trust fund in every conversation, casual at first. "Have you thought about what we'll do with the distribution this year?" Then more insistent. He wanted access, wanted to be added as a co-trustee, said it was about building our future together and making smart family decisions. Then came the pressure about my grandmother's house, that beautiful Victorian estate that had been in my family for generations, the place where I'd learned to walk and read and dream. Grant wanted me to sell it. Not just sell it, but sell it immediately, while the market was hot. He brought in appraisers without asking me, had real estate agents coincidentally reach out, even drafted listing documents that he left lying around for me to find. "Think about what we could do with that money, Elena," he'd say, eyes gleaming with something that definitely wasn't love. "The baby will need a college fund. We could travel. We could invest. Your grandmother's been dead for 3 years. It's just a house. Just a house. Like my family legacy, my heritage, my connection to the women who came before me, was something you could just liquidate for cash." I kept saying no, kept putting him off, and I could feel his frustration building like pressure in a sealed container. The cheated feeling I had wasn't about another woman yet. It was about realizing the man I married cared more about my assets than about me. But I still didn't understand the full scope of his betrayal. Still didn't know that every conversation about money, every push to sell the house, every attempt to access my trust, was part of a master plan so vicious it would make your blood run cold. That plan was already in motion. The pieces were already in place. And in just a few more months, he was going to spring the trap that would either destroy me completely or, if I was very, very lucky, give me the ammunition I needed to destroy him first. So there I was, back in that ultrasound room with Dr. Brennan, the door closed, my whole world tilting on its axis. She took a deep breath and said something that made absolutely no sense at first. My sister works at Meridian Fertility Center. She's a nurse there, has been for 8 years. Her name is Molly. I just stared at her, not understanding what her sister had to do with my marriage, my pregnancy, my husband's name on that intake form. But then Dr. Brennan's voice cracked, and she said the words that detonated my entire life. 3 days ago, Molly came to me sobbing, said she couldn't live with what she'd done anymore. Elena, your husband paid her and the embryologist, to switch your IVF sample with donor sperm. You never conceived with Grant's genetic material. This baby isn't biologically his. The room started spinning, and I'm not being dramatic. It actually spun, like the floor had turned into a carnival ride. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, couldn't process it, because it was too insane, too elaborate, too impossibly cruel to be real. That's not possible, I whispered. But even as I said it, I knew it was true. I knew it in the way you know things in your gut before your brain catches up, in the way prey animals sense predators before they see them. Dr. Brennan kept talking, faster now, like she needed to get it all out before I completely broke down. Grant had approached Molly 6 months before we even started IVF. Had researched the clinic specifically because he knew she worked there. Had offered her $50,000 to help him execute what he called a foolproof plan. Here's where it gets diabolical, where the revenge he'd been plotting reveals itself in all its horrifying clarity. Grant's scheme wasn't just about the baby. It was about destroying me completely and walking away rich. The plan had phases, like some twisted heist movie, except I was the bank he was robbing. Phase 1. Convince me we needed IVF because of his infertility. Phase 2. Control the clinic choice and paperwork. Phase 3. Have the embryologist switch the genetic material without my knowledge. Phase 4. Wait for the baby to be born, looking like the devoted husband the whole time. And Phase 5. This is where my stomach literally turned over. Phase 5 was the kill shot. Once the baby was here, Grant was going to suggest a paternity test, something casual like, wouldn't it be fun to see whose eyes she has? The test would obviously show he wasn't the biological father, and that's when he'd accuse me of infidelity. Not just accuse me, prove it, using the falsified records Molly and the embryologist had created showing that I'd specifically requested donor sperm without his knowledge. Our prenuptial agreement, the one his lawyer had insisted on, and I'd signed without really reading because I trusted him, had an infidelity clause. If either of us cheated, the guilty party would face severe financial and reputational consequences. Grant was going to use my own baby, my own trust, my own desperation for a family against me. He was going to paint me as a cheater, destroy my reputation in our social circle, and probably go after my grandmother's house in the settlement. And once the fraud came to light, his precious infidelity clause would become useless. But Grant didn't know that yet. But it was even worse than that, because Dr. Brennan wasn't finished. Molly said he talked about it like a game. She told me, her voice thick with disgust. He called you his golden goose, said women like you were so desperate to prove you weren't like your uptight mothers that you'd believe anything. He told Molly that once he humiliated you publicly, exposed the affair, and leveraged the situation for money, he'd use the shame and scandal to pressure you into selling the estate. Said you'd be so devastated and embarrassed you'd want to leave town, start fresh somewhere else, and he'd be right there to help you liquidate everything. The truth was so much worse than simple betrayal. This was premeditated destruction. A long con that had started the day he met me at that charity gala, maybe even before. I wasn't his wife. I was his mark. And our baby? Our beautiful, innocent baby was just a weapon he'd commissioned to use against me. I sat in that exam room for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, just breathing, just trying to absorb the magnitude of what I'd learned. Dr. Brennan stayed with me the entire time, holding my hand, apologizing over and over even though none of this was her fault. When I could finally speak without my voice shaking, I asked her why Molly had confessed. Why now? Why at all? Guilt, she said simply. Molly's not a bad person. She just made a terrible choice when she was desperate for money. But carrying that secret, knowing what Grant was planning to do to you, knowing there was an innocent baby involved, it broke her. She came to me because she knew I could reach you, warn you, maybe stop this before it was too late. The justice in that moment, the karma of Grant's own conspiracy turning against him, gave me my first spark of clarity through the shock. Here's what I didn't do. I didn't go home and scream at Grant. I didn't cry, didn't throw things, didn't give him any indication that I knew, because something happened in that exam room with Dr. Brennan. Something cold and sharp settled in my chest, replacing the panic and betrayal with something much more dangerous. Calculation. If Grant could play the long game, so could I. If he could smile in my face while plotting my destruction, I could smile right back while building his downfall. Dr. Brennan gave me Molly's number, made me promise I'd be careful, and I walked out of that clinic like I was floating outside my own body. I drove home, walked through the door, and when Grant asked how the appointment went, I smiled and said, "Perfect. The baby's healthy. Everything's exactly as it should be." That night, lying next to him in bed, feeling him press his hand against my belly like he had any right to touch this child, I started planning. First thing next morning, while Grant was at work, and who knows what he was actually doing, I called a private investigator. Not just any PI, but the best in the city. A woman named Rosalind Weaver who specialized in marital fraud and had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless. I met her in a coffee shop across town, somewhere Grant would never go, and I laid out everything Dr. Brennan had told me. Rosalind didn't even blink, just pulled out a notepad and started writing. "You want the truth," she said, and it wasn't a question. All of it. Every lie, every secret, every piece of dirt he's buried. And then you want to bury him with it. Over the next 6 weeks, while I played the happy pregnant wife at home, Rosalind excavated Grant's entire life. The shocking things she found made Dr. Brennan's revelation look like the tip of an iceberg. Grant wasn't just a con artist. He was drowning in debt. Gambling debt specifically, $180,000 owed to some very unpleasant people, the kind who don't accept payment plans. He'd been embezzling from his clients at the financial firm. Small amounts at first, but escalating, nearly $200,000 that he'd funneled through fake accounts, his work trips, and late nights at the office. He was sleeping with his assistant, a 24-year-old named Amber who had no idea he was married until Rosalind showed her the wedding photos. But here's the part that made my blood actually boil. I wasn't his first mark. Rosalind found 2 other women, both from wealthy families, both of whom Grant had dated seriously about 5 and 7 years ago. He'd gotten engaged to one of them, moved in with the other, and in both cases he'd pushed hard for access to their money before the relationships mysteriously fell apart. One of them, a woman named Catherine, told Rosalind that Grant had tried to convince her to take out a massive loan against her inheritance, said he had an investment opportunity that couldn't miss. When she refused and started asking questions, he ghosted her completely, just vanished like he'd never existed. This wasn't a one-time thing, wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness. This was his business model. Find vulnerable women with money, exploit their desire for love and family, extract maximum value, and disappear. Except with me, he'd gotten more sophisticated. With me, he'd built a trap so elaborate, it would have worked perfectly if Molly's conscience hadn't cracked at exactly the right moment. The hardest phone call I've ever made in my life was the one to my mother. 2 years of silence, 2 years of missed birthdays and holidays, 2 years of choosing the wrong person over the woman who'd loved me since before I took my first breath. I sat in my car outside a grocery store at 8 in the morning, 7 months pregnant, hands shaking as I pulled up her contact, a contact I'd almost deleted 100 times but never could. When she answered, her voice was cautious, guarded, like she was afraid to hope I was really calling. "Mom," I said, and my voice cracked on that one syllable, and suddenly I was sobbing so hard I couldn't breathe. "Mom, you were right. You were right about everything, and I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, I should have listened." She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't lecture me or remind me of all the warnings I'd ignored. She just said, in that voice that had comforted me through every childhood nightmare and teenage heartbreak, "Where are you, baby? What do you need?" I told her everything. The IVF scheme, the embezzlement, The other women, the trap waiting to spring shut the moment my baby was born. And my mother, God bless her, didn't waste a single second on shock or disbelief. She went straight into action mode, that fierce dignity that all the women in our family carry like a birthright. "Come to the house," she said. "Right now. Don't go home. Don't tell Grant anything. I'm making calls." The payback for 2 years of silence was her dropping everything. No questions asked, no grudges held, just pure maternal protection kicking into overdrive. Vivian didn't just make calls. She activated an entire network. Within 3 hours of me arriving at the estate, my childhood home that I'd abandoned for a man who was planning to steal it, my mother had assembled a war council. There was Sandra Kowalski, a divorce attorney so notorious that people called her the Shark, who handled cases for senators and CEOs. There was Marcus Chen, a criminal prosecutor my mother knew from charity boards, who specialized in fraud and embezzlement. There was Rosalind, who brought her entire file on Grant, and I mean entire, 3 binders worth of evidence. And there was Molly, Dr. Brennan's sister, who sat in my mother's library looking terrified but determined, ready to confess everything and face whatever consequences came her way. Sandra took one look at the prenup, the IVF paperwork, and Rosalind's evidence, and actually laughed. Not a happy laugh, but the kind lawyers make when they know they've got an airtight case. "He's not just going to lose," she said, flipping through the documents. "He's going to lose everything, and then he's going to jail. Fraud, conspiracy, embezzlement, identity theft. Marcus, you seeing this?" The prosecutor nodded, already making notes, already building a criminal case that would run parallel to the divorce. They explained that Grant's plan had actually created perfect evidence of his own crimes. The falsified medical records, the payments to Molly and the embryologist, the paper trail of the embezzlement. He documented his own conspiracy because he'd been so confident, so arrogant, that he never imagined getting caught. The truth about revenge is that it's not about anger. It's about patience. And justice, real justice, isn't about screaming and confrontation. It's about building a case so solid, so documented, so undeniable that the person who tried to destroy you has no defense, no escape, no way to charm or lie their way out. We spent the next month coordinating everything. The police got involved, quietly interviewed Molly and the embryologist, who immediately flipped when he realized he was facing criminal charges and offered full cooperation. Grant's firm was alerted to the embezzlement, and they froze his accounts, launched an internal investigation, started preparing their own lawsuit. A warrant was prepared, but not executed yet, because we had one more thing to do. We had to let Grant spring his trap, had to let him think he'd won, had to give him enough rope to hang himself in the most public, most humiliating way possible, because that's what he'd planned for me. And karma was about to come full circle. I was 8.5 months pregnant when I told Grant I wanted to have a celebration at my grandmother's estate. "Just close friends and family," I said, rubbing my enormous belly, playing the sweet, naive wife he thought I was. "I want our baby to be welcomed into the family legacy, you know? Something intimate, maybe 50 people in the gardens." I watched his eyes light up, watched him try to hide how perfect this was for his plan. A public gathering, witnesses everywhere, the perfect stage to humiliate me and stake his claim to the property he'd been salivating over for years. "That sounds beautiful, baby," he said, kissing my forehead. "Let me help you plan it. I want everything to be perfect for you." The lies tasted like poison every time I had to smile and pretend I believed him. We planned that party together, and it was almost funny watching him maneuver, watching him suggest we invite certain people, his lawyer, some of his business associates, people who could serve as witnesses to my infidelity when he revealed it. I played along with everything, even let him think he was controlling the guest list. What he didn't know was that my mother and Sandra had carefully curated who was really coming. The detective assigned to his case, Marcus the prosecutor with his wife as cover, 3 of Grant's former clients who'd been embezzled, Catherine, one of his previous marks who was eager to watch him fall, a retired judge who was my mother's college roommate, and Derek, the actual sperm donor whose genetic material had been used without his knowledge or consent. When Derek learned his genetic material had been used without consent, he cooperated formally and made it clear he wanted no involvement. The day of the party was perfect. Late August, early fall, the gardens in full bloom, white tents set up on the lawn, catering stations everywhere. I wore a flowing dress that made me look ethereal and vulnerable, played up the pregnancy glow, let Grant parade me around like a trophy he'd already won. He was so confident, so relaxed, cracking jokes and shaking hands. The perfect, charming husband. Around hour 2, after everyone had eaten and the champagne was flowing, the champagne I couldn't drink but he certainly enjoyed, Grant clinked his glass and asked for everyone's attention. "I want to make a toast," he announced, pulling me close, his hand possessive on my waist. This was it. This was the moment he'd been building toward for nearly 3 years. "Elena and I are about to become parents," he started, and everyone clapped, and I felt him squeeze my waist tighter. "And I think, in the spirit of welcoming our child into this world, we should celebrate complete honesty and transparency in our family." My heart was hammering, but I kept my face serene, kept my smile gentle. "So I've been thinking, wouldn't it be wonderful to do one of those genetic tests? You know, see whose eyes she gets, whose nose, build a complete family tree?" The shocking part was how smoothly he delivered it, how reasonable it sounded, how the crowd murmured in agreement. Because why wouldn't you want that information? He looked at me with those lying eyes and said, "What do you think, honey? Should we do a paternity test? Just for fun? Just to see the science of how we made this miracle?" That's when I stepped away from him, took the microphone from his hand, and let my smile drop. The change in my expression made the crowd go quiet, made Grant's face flicker with confusion. "That's a wonderful idea, Grant," I said, and my voice was ice, was steel, was every woman in my family who'd ever refused to be broken. "Let's talk about paternity. Let's talk about genetics. Let's talk about honesty and transparency. But first, let's talk about the truth. And I mean the real truth, not the lies you've been feeding everyone for 3 years. I watched the color drain from his face, watched him realize in real time that something had gone terribly, horribly wrong. "Ladies and gentlemen," I continued, looking out at 50 pairs of eyes that were now locked on me, "let me tell you about the man you think you know. Let me tell you about betrayal, about conspiracy, about a con so elaborate it almost worked. Almost. I had everything printed out. Bank statements, medical records, screenshots of text messages, photos of Grant with Amber his assistant, signed affidavits from Molly and the embryologist, testimony from his former clients. My mother's staff brought out poster boards we'd prepared, displayed them on easels around the garden like some twisted art gallery of deception. "Grant Mercer," I said, my voice carrying across the silent crowd, "approached Molly Brennan 6 months before we started IVF and paid her $50,000 to switch our genetic material with donor sperm. He falsified medical records, conspired with clinic staff, and orchestrated an elaborate scheme to frame me for infidelity, so he could invoke our prenuptial agreement and destroy my reputation while stealing from me." The gasps from the crowd were audible, but I wasn't done. "The baby I'm carrying, our baby, was conceived through IVF, but not with Grant's genetic material. And that wasn't an accident. That was phase 3 of a 5-phase plan that Grant documented in his own emails, which the police now have copies of." I gestured to one of the poster boards showing printed emails where Grant literally outlined his strategy to someone he called his partner. We still didn't know who that was, but the police were investigating. Grant stood frozen, his face cycling through shock, panic, and rage, his mouth opening and closing, but no words coming out. The humiliation I saw in his eyes was everything he'd planned to inflict on me, reflected back at him 100-fold. "But wait, there's more," I continued, channeling every courtroom drama I'd ever watched, feeling the power of truth and evidence on my side. While Grant was planning to destroy me, he was also embezzling from his clients, approximately $190,000 over 18 months, to cover gambling debts that currently total about $180,000. He's been cheating on me with his assistant Amber for 7 months, and before me, he ran the same con on at least 2 other women from wealthy families. Catherine stood up from the crowd, raised her hand in a little wave. "Hi, Grant. she called out, her voice dripping with vindictive satisfaction. "Remember me? Remember how you tried to get me to take out a loan for your investment opportunity? Karma's a bitch, isn't it?" Then I played my final card, the one that made this not just personal revenge but actual justice. "Molly, would you please stand?" The young nurse stood up, trembling but resolute. Derek Morrison, our donor, who had no idea his genetic material was being used. "Would you stand?" A tall man in his 30s stood, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Detective Williams, would you like to do the honors?" A man in a suit near the back of the crowd stepped forward, and that's when Grant finally found his voice. "This is insane," he sputtered, looking around for support, for anyone who might believe him. "She's lying. She's pregnant and emotional. A judge had already signed the warrant that morning. We just needed him in the room. Detective Williams was already reading him his rights, and the sound of handcuffs clicking shut was the most satisfying sound I'd ever heard in my life. The payback wasn't just in the arrest, though watching Grant being led away in handcuffs in front of 50 witnesses was pretty damn sweet. It was in the complete and total destruction of every lie he'd built, every manipulation he'd crafted, every assumption he'd made about me being weak and controllable. As the police car pulled away, the crowd erupted. Not in celebration exactly, but in this shocked, almost cathartic release of tension. People came up to me, some crying, some angry on my behalf, all of them wanting to know if I was okay, if the baby was okay. My mother wrapped her arms around me, and for the first time in weeks, I let myself actually feel the weight of what I'd been carrying. "He thought he could break you," she whispered in my ear. He had no idea who he was dealing with. The legal fallout was swift and brutal. Grant was denied bail. The judge cited flight risk and the severity of the charges, which now included fraud, conspiracy, embezzlement, identity theft, and a few other crimes the DA kept adding as they dug deeper. His firm released a statement within 48 hours, confirming the embezzlement investigation and announcing they were pursuing full restitution plus damages. Amber, his assistant and mistress, disappeared so fast you'd think she'd never existed. Deleted all her social media, moved back to whatever town she came from. When she realized she'd been used too, she tried to run from the scandal, until the subpoena found her. The Meridian Fertility Center fired Molly and the embryologist, but because they'd cooperated with authorities, the prosecutor agreed to reduce charges and probation instead of jail time. The prenuptial agreement that Grant had planned to weaponize against me became a complex legal issue. Sandra, my shark of a lawyer, pointed out that Sandra told me later he'd never be able to enforce that infidelity clause, not once the fraud was proven. And his affair with Amber, documented in hotel receipts and text messages and testimony, became leverage in civil claims and restitution targets. Because of the embezzlement and fraud, the court froze all his assets, which meant I'd probably never see much of that money. But honestly, I didn't care about the money. I cared about the justice, about watching a man who thought he was untouchable face actual consequences for once in his miserable life. Vivian was born before the case ever reached a jury. My daughter arrived in October, healthy and perfect, weighing 7 pounds, 3 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and eyes that would eventually turn hazel. Months later, when I walked into that courtroom with a baby at home, Vivian already sleeping through the night in my mother's guest wing, Grant's charm finally met evidence. The trial itself moved faster than anyone expected. Grant's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but Marcus the prosecutor wasn't interested in deals. He wanted this case to go to trial, wanted it to be public, wanted it to serve as a warning to anyone else who thought they could exploit the IVF system or prey on vulnerable women. The evidence was so overwhelming that Grant's defense basically crumbled in the first week. Molly testified. The embryologist testified. Derek the donor testified. Grant's former clients testified about the embezzlement. Amber was subpoenaed and had to admit to the affair. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before coming back with guilty verdicts on all counts. When the judge sentenced Grant to 8 years in prison plus restitution to all his victims, I was sitting in that courtroom with a baby at home, Vivian already sleeping through the night in my mother's guest wing. I watched Grant stand there in an orange jumpsuit, watched the man who'd once been so charming and confident and in control look small and broken and utterly defeated. He turned to look at me before they led him away, and I don't know what he expected to see. Tears, maybe, or regret, or some sign that I still cared. But I just looked back at him with nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just nothing. He'd earned every second of that sentence, and my part in his story was over. The backstabbed had become the victor, and there was a certain poetry in that. Vivian had already given me my reason to survive. Now the court was giving him consequences. I named her Vivian, after my mother, because family isn't about DNA or biology. It's about who shows up, who fights for you, who stays. Derek, the donor, had signed the legal statements confirming he had no parental claim and wanted no involvement, which was fine by me. This was my daughter, mine and my family's, and no one else's. The truth about her conception would stay sealed in legal documents unless she decided as an adult that she wanted to know. For now, she was just mine, just loved, just perfect. The first few months of motherhood were a blur of sleepless nights and endless diapers and this overwhelming love I'd never experienced before. I moved back into my grandmother's estate permanently. The house Grant had tried so hard to make me sell. The house that represented everything he'd wanted to take from me. Walking through those halls with baby Vivian in my arms, showing her the portrait of her great-great-grandmother in the library, sitting in the garden where I'd exposed Grant's lies. It felt like reclaiming not just a house, but my entire identity. My self-worth wasn't tied to a man anymore, wasn't dependent on being chosen or loved by someone who saw me as a transaction. I was enough, had always been enough, and now I had proof. My mother moved into the guest wing, and we rebuilt our relationship day by day, conversation by conversation, apology by apology. She never once said, "I told you so." Never threw my mistakes in my face. She just showed up, for midnight feedings, for pediatrician appointments, for the days when I felt overwhelmed and inadequate and terrified. I'd mess up this little life depending on me. "You're a Harrison woman," she'd tell me when I doubted myself. "We've survived wars, depressions, scandals, and heartbreaks for 4 generations. A con artist in a cheap suit was never going to be the thing that broke us." That dignity, that unshakable sense of who we were and what we deserved, that was the real inheritance, more valuable than any trust fund or property deed. Sometimes people ask me if I regret anything, if I wish I'd never met Grant or married him, or gone through hell and back. And here's the truth. I can't regret it, because it gave me Vivian. She wasn't conceived the way I thought she was. Her origin story is complicated and messy, and involves lawyers and criminal trials. But she's mine. Every smile, every laugh, every tiny hand wrapped around my finger. She's the good that came from something terrible. Grant tried to use her as a weapon, tried to turn my desire for family into a trap. But instead, she became my salvation. The revenge he planned backfired in the most beautiful way possible, because instead of destroying me, his scheme gave me the daughter I always wanted and the strength I didn't know I had. I think about Dr. Brennan sometimes, about how different my life would be if she hadn't seen Grant's name on that intake form, if her sister Molly hadn't confessed, if the guilt hadn't eaten away at people until they broke. That's the thing about elaborate lies. They require everyone to stay silent, everyone to keep their piece of the secret, and humans aren't built for that kind of sustained deception. Someone always talks. Someone always cracks. Karma always finds a way. Grant's downfall wasn't just my victory. It was proof that you can't build a life on betrayal and expect it to stand. Eventually, the truth comes out. Eventually, justice catches up. Eventually, the people you underestimate turn out to be stronger than you ever imagined. I'm sitting in my grandmother's garden right now as I tell you this story, watching Vivian toddle through the roses on unsteady legs, her laugh echoing off the old stone walls. Grant is in prison, serving his sentence, and I genuinely hope he's learned something, though I doubt it. Men like him rarely do. But that's not my problem anymore, not my burden to carry. I survived his attempt to destroy me, I protected my daughter, I reclaimed my family and my home, and I came out the other side not broken but forged stronger. He thought he was backstabbing a naive, rich girl who'd be easy to manipulate. Instead, he woke up a woman who knew her worth, who demanded justice, and who refused to be anyone's victim. And that, more than any prison sentence or financial penalty, is the real victory. He lost everything by underestimating me, and I gained everything by finally seeing myself clearly. So that's my story. The ultrasound that changed everything, the doctor who saved my life, the husband who tried to destroy me, and the revenge that became justice. But now I want to hear from you, because I know I'm not alone in this. How many of you have had that moment where you realize someone you trusted was playing you the whole time? That sick feeling in your stomach when all the pieces suddenly click into place and you understand you've been living a lie? Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever discovered a betrayal so deep it made you question everything? How did you handle it? Did you get your revenge? Or did you walk away? And be honest, if you'd been in my position, what would you have done differently? Here's what I really want to know. Do you think I went too far with the public exposure? Or was Grant getting exactly what he deserved? Some people have told me I should have handled it privately, that humiliating him in front of 50 people was too harsh. But after everything he planned to do to me, after the years of manipulation and lies, I don't think I went far enough. What's your take? Was this justice, or was it just revenge dressed up in legal paperwork? And here's the question that keeps me up at night. How many other men like Grant are out there right now, running the same con on women who have no idea what's coming? If my story sounds familiar, if you've seen these red flags in your own life or in someone you love, please share this. Someone out there might need to hear it. I want to hear your stories too. The betrayals you've survived, the family drama that nearly broke you, the moment you decided enough was enough and fought back. Did you have your own doctor closing the door moment? That instant where someone told you a truth you didn't want to hear but desperately needed to know? Tell me in the comments what your wake-up call was, because these stories matter. They help other people recognize the warning signs before it's too late. And if you're going through something similar right now, if you're reading this and thinking, oh my God, this sounds like my life, then please trust your instincts. You're not crazy, you're not paranoid, and you deserve better than someone who sees you as a target instead of a partner. Before you go, I need you to do something for me. Actually, do it for yourself. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because the stories I share on this channel aren't just entertainment. They're warnings, they're validations, they're proof that you're not alone in whatever nightmare you're navigating. Every week I bring you real stories about family betrayal, shocking revelations, and the kind of justice that restores your faith in karma. These aren't fairy tales. They're survival guides disguised as story time. And trust me, the next story I have lined up is going to blow your mind even more than this one. It involves the inheritance, a forged will, and sisters who took sibling rivalry to absolutely criminal levels. So subscribe, comment, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and remember, the people who underestimate you are setting themselves up for the fall of their lives. You are stronger than you know, smarter than they think, and more worthy than they could ever comprehend. Don't let anyone, and I mean anyone, make you feel small, controllable, or easy to manipulate. You are not a mark. You are not a victim. You are a force. And when you finally decide to show them who you really are, they won't know what hit them. Now go ahead and tell me your story in the comments. I'm reading every single one, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say.